I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Steven Thalheimer. He is the superintendent of the Elkhart Community School District and recently completed his PhD in educational leadership from Indiana University. Unless you think that he just recently entered the field of education, I'll disabuse you of that. He has actually been involved in education for nearly 30 years, and that experience, I think, brings such a richness and depth to his work. He is our 2021 winner of the APASA Paper Prize for his truly fascinating research published in JABUS in 2021, and we are eager to hear more about that work today. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Thalheimer, and speaking with us about your work on why Amish parents send their children to public schools.
Thank you, Natalie, very much. I would like to thank the association and the Journal editorial board for this annual award and the honor of speaking at today's cafe. If you will indulge me, I'll start today with a little bit of an origin story. So if we go in the time machine back to the summer of 2013, I was the superintendent at Fairfield Community Schools in the southeastern part of Elkhart County, about 25 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And the principal at Millersburg Elementary School, which at the time was about 55, maybe 60% Amish, came to me and had a copy of a letter that a parent had written her, indicating about how much they regretted leaving Millersburg Elementary School. We had begun to recover from the Great Recession, and there was a great deal of pressure within the Amish community and the Amish affiliations and churches for those family members to start sending their students back to the Amish school, paying the tuition and returning to the Amish schools. And so reluctantly, this parent wrote this letter, and in it talked about all the great things they loved about Millersburg Elementary School, but then some of the things that were interfering and some of the things that were problematic about leaving Millersburg Elementary School and going to what Fairfield has as a junior senior high school. So they would be in this environment through grade 6, then would go to a junior senior high school that was grade 7 through 12, and the transition was difficult. So we thought a lot about that summer and embarked that fall in 2013 on a listening tour. So the principal at that building and at one of our other elementary schools that had a high number of Amish students engaged in some conversations with involved parents and the groups and affiliations within their school, and had some initial conversations. And then I came to conversations with those same groups of people so that I was hearing what they were saying. And then we combined the two groups from the two different schools into a larger group and had a conversation. And then we had another conversation where we invited all of those parents to bring somebody else to the table. So we kept widening the circle with these conversations about what we as a public school were doing. And I recall that when we had this largest meeting where people brought someone along with them, we had talked about what does the school do well? What are the concerns they have about being in public schools? What kind of things are getting in the way? What might have people consider leaving our public school? And if they could dream or if it could look different, what would they like it to look like? And that was a very interesting question to pose, because as a collective group of people, they're not used to asking for things. And so for us to say, what would you like it to look like? There was this long, uncomfortable silence. And then we started offering some prompts and getting some feedback. We went through that whole conversation and we arrived at the end of the evening, and I thanked them all for their time. And I said, is there anything else we need to think about or know about before we would, have these conversations further or start thinking about what we want to do as the district? And there was this elderly man sitting back against the stacks in the media center, back along the row of books, full white beard, and he sat there and said, everybody was kind of looking at him, and he didn't say anything at first, and then finally he spoke up and he said, I've been waiting for 30 years for a conversation like this to happen, and it finally has happened. So I have always had this affiliation and connection and affinity for working with the Amish there, because they were so integral to our school district and sprinkled across our 3 elementary schools, and then would go into our junior high school. And then obviously, as most Amish do, would leave at the end of 8th grade. And so listening through all of those conversations, and as we made plans for what to do that following spring, I had a lot of information and assumptions about why Amish sent their kids to public school. And so when I entered the process of writing my dissertation, everybody kept saying, write about something you're passionate about, write about something you really know. You're going to be really engaged in this work, so you need to make sure that it's something that you're going to be able to remain engaged with. Hence, I wrote my dissertation over this. So the article that appeared in JAPAS is a substantial reduction from a 200-page qualitative dissertation. And so Corey was very helpful in helping do appropriate edits for the journal, but it really reflects that piece. What we went on to do after those conversations with the Amish families was that we began a campaign that's referenced in the article called the Our Communities, Our Schools effort. And in that, we used the spring of 2014 and the 2014-15 school year to propose that we work on career pathways for all students, that we make some major renovations to our junior, senior high school and to a couple of our other buildings. And the central piece to it was that we converted Millersburg Elementary School from a K-6 building to a K-8 elementary middle school. That way, those Amish students were able to stay in that building for their entire educational career. We created a middle school wing with an industrial technology shop space, a kitchen space, so we were able to do those practical arts, career tech education pieces, in addition to bringing in German language as an elective for those 6th, 7th, and 8th graders within that building. And in the fall of 2016, we opened that building as a K-8 building. So when I started my dissertation work and I was surveying everything that was out there, there is a lot of information about the role of Amish schools and how Amish schools operate, but really kind of a dearth of it regarding Amish attending public schools. 2 of the scholars that are really out there and had done work in this area were McConnell and Hurst, and they had done some major work in 2006 and 2010. And looking at schools in Ohio, they pulled out that a lot of the reasons that the Amish parents that they interviewed went to public school was for the quality of schools and the teachers involved, the desire to be exposed to non-Amish families, teaching advanced skills and skills for the world of work beyond agriculture, and the draw that the public schools and their amenities had. But my feeling and the work of working with those families so intently is that I always felt it was something deeper. And so I saw it as something more fundamental to their faith and the history of the sect, and to the concept of education within a democracy. And those were the things that I was beginning to pick up on, but it wasn't until I really did the research that I saw that actually bear out. So when I did my dissertation, chapter 2, which was the historical underpinnings and the theoretical framework, I like to say that it got away from me. It was several dozen pages that went through a broad scope of the history of the Amish, what Amish education looks like, and any interaction that the Amish do have with public schools and what has influenced that over time. And so it traced the history of the Amish and the general good and right of a public education. But then I saw lots of conversations about other things. There were lots of dialectical concepts that I saw happening that weren't always so cut and dry. So one of those that came up for me was the concept of utilitarianism. Lots of people see education as being preparation for the future, and it needs to be directed towards those ends. And so we educate students so that they can become primarily good workers and good citizens. And so there's a practical piece to that. So there's a value to that. But then on the flip side, there's also this values aspect of education, that we're developing people as people. We're developing people as, taking care of the whole child, so that they're developing their unique talents and gifts to be able to do that. So how is that balanced, and is one of those favored more than the other as Amish parents are considering sending their children to school? One of the other things that I came across was this notion of new localism that had been borne out by the Labour Party movement in Great Britain, where they were devolving central control back to the local area. And in that, there was a lot of local responsibility that was taken. And so there's this interesting tension, particularly in Indiana, where we're supposed to be a locally controlled state, where education is controlled by local state school boards, yet there sure is an awful lot of intervention that's happening from the state level with mandates and the things that come from the state. So how do we balance that, the local control, the local aspect, with the desire from the state and even the federal government regarding educational policy? So that value piece around the new localism and the utilitarianism was there. But I also saw that we see within education this, cultural symbols and the things that are happening there. And one of the aspects that I saw at work was also Clifford Geertz's idea that religion is a model of and a model for behavior. So when we think about a religious group forming or a religion forming, the religion serves as a model of, so it represents the belief system of the people, and then it also is a model for behavior and action going forward. So it's reflective and kind of cyclical. And the Ordnung within the Amish tradition operates the same way. It reflects the values of the community, but it also provides a guide for how people are to act and behave. So I saw lots of those things happening between the values and value that education might provide. And then one of the other pieces that I referenced in my dissertation and in the article is a concept from Levinson and Levinson from 2003, that the idea for students who come from a religious tradition to go to a public school and have those ideas tested, if you will, is a sure way for their belief system to be promoted and to be reinforced. That if they're able to go to the public school and have that challenged and interact with the real world and have that reinforced from home, then it becomes a way of what's called autonomy promotion. And so the public schools provide that opportunity as well as students learn to coexist, which reflects back to McConnell and Hearst's idea that the schools become a place where you're learning to interact with non-Amish as well. And then one of the other concepts that was really important to me was that Strike talked about in a 1991 piece about how institutions model character and vice versa, that they represent what we're supposed to be as a democracy, and they also help inform and train people how to operate within a democracy. And so how do we engage in some new localism? How do we have our school district representative and truly have parental participation and parental engagement so that we are able to have those schools be reflective of the community's will and it's appropriate to the people within that community? So as I looked at all of those pieces, those were the things that were forming the theoretical framework and the considerations that I thought were there. I wasn't able to delve into that as much in the depth of the article, but they were things that I really looked at in terms of the dissertation. And particularly one of the things that overlapped, that grew out of this new localism idea, and I did reference in the article, was Schrager from 2001 saw this dialecticism that was happening between new localism and different groups in society. So he said that within society, there are groups that come together and form contracts. So basically, they're a contractarian group that agree that it is to our benefit to operate this way together. And so a lot of times people will do that, but it's still driven by the desire and the will of the individual. You can decide whether to be part of that contract or that arrangement or not. On the opposite end, he said that there were groups that are deep. We call those deep groups. And those deep groups would be a group where the group mores or the group control really dominated what happened and the individual becomes secondary. Obviously, we can see the connection there to the Amish. So if you have these two groups and in a public institution like a public school, you have very individualistic people who are from a classical liberal notion of the individual, and then you would have the deep sense of the groups as well. And so Schrager talked that for new localism to work and for societies to work at that ground level, you need to have something that fits in between there. And so he talked about a dualist approach where the sense of community is arrived at by some loss of your individuality and not a total assumption by the society as a whole, but you dance down the middle. And that's very much what we saw at work with these families as we would have our conversations with them and try to navigate what would happen. And so, referencing what Pratchett had talked about, there's a freedom to something, you get something out of it, but there's a freedom from something. You have to watch that you're not totally giving up who you are and your community ethos to do this in order to develop your local identity. So I wanted to just take a little bit of an opportunity to flesh out some more of those conversations and contradictions and things that I was seeing at work that helped inform the study overall. So as you saw in the journal article, the story itself was a series of semi-structured interviews, and I did those with the intent of sending out invitations to all Amish families within Fairfield Community Schools. The school board provided me permission to do so, and I sent those out to all families as an invitation letter. I had struggled with the idea that I, as the superintendent, would have this dual role in doing the study. And it was a very interesting and a real knot to try to untie, because I knew that a stranger contacting Amish families to try to engage in this work would not yield any interviews or results, or very, very few. And so you couldn't have a neutral or unknown interviewer go in and do this. However, I going in and doing that with the role that I had as an authority within the school district would prove problematic. So I explored some different avenues. The Meadowhoff Historical Center that's in the county next door, I had talked to them about would they be interested in maybe helping with this process and bridging that and bringing what would appear to be a little bit more objectivity to the process. And they said it didn't fit with their mission, and they don't really engage any research like that. There's a local alliance for education that's neutral within the district, within the county, that supports, but again, we couldn't see that fitting their mission, and again, people responding to that any better. So in my work with our institutional review board at Indiana State, where I was doing my work, and with my chair, Dr. Donlin, we just decided, let's make the case that you have to be the one to do the work. And the Research Foundation supports that. So we did that. So letters went out from me inviting families to do that. And I had been hoping to do around 30. And when we got to the deadline, we were short of that. So it involved some revising of my IRB application and some other technical things. But I got to the point where I had 14 interview sets or 26 individuals, 12 sets of parents, both parents, and then 2 individual fathers that would respond to my semi-structured interviews. So I arranged back and forth. We got those interviews scheduled. I did those. I offered to do them at a neutral site, at the school, at our administration office, or at their home, trying to make it as convenient as possible for them to take part. All accepted the opportunity to do the invitation in their home. So I went to those and then recorded those with a digital recorder. I did not have any reluctance or resistance to recording the interviews, which ran counter to some interview protocol research I had seen from another interviewer earlier back in the 80s. And so I was able to conduct those interviews. In the article, you saw the interview protocol I asked. I took those those interviews and then transcribed them. Would recommend, if anyone has not used Trent software before, I don't get a kickback on this, but it is a transcribing software that saved me a great amount of time. And it was very accurate and time saving. So after I had all those transcribed, then I went through and just started color coding and finding themes and finding things that were recurrent. A lot of what I found at the surface level echoed those 4 main points from McConnell and Hurst. But I also was noticing some subtlety in there. And I didn't want it to just replicate what McConnell and Hurst had done. So I really started thinking about those lined up with what I knew from my conversations and all of those. And so there's a chart in the article that represents the breakdown of the general themes around institutional, instructional, and social categories that they began to fit in, mainly in the instructional and social, but some institutional and some of those things that reference the draws to the public school. And then as I really looked at my research questions, what factors contribute to public schools? What changes are occurring? What can they tolerate? What are they accepting of? And then still what's closed off, or what are they resistant to, helped me form what I felt was a very solid ethnography of this group of people. And one of the pieces on page 32 in the article that I reference is an article by Denzin. And it really spoke to me because since I'd worked so much with these families, I really wanted to honor the Amish voice with my thick description and the content of what I was doing. I felt worried sometimes that I was excerpting interviews a little too much, that the direct quotation of my interview subjects was getting a little long, and maybe that's why my dissertation went 200 pages. But I very much wanted to be able to capture the entire context of something that they were talking about and to capture that voice and be true. So when I went to put all of that together, again, the McConnell and Hearst pieces were sitting there in the middle, but I knew that there was more going on with that. And in another context during this time, I had been doing some work with Simon Sinek and his book, Start With Why. And if you're not familiar with that, basically Sinek says that organizations look at what they do in kind of three different ways. Most organizations will look at the what that they do, the big outer circle. So if I'm a business, we make widgets, that's what we do. Then inside that is your how. So it gets a little more into processes and systems and thinking about what you do and how you do it. So in education, we educate students, we make little people. How do we do that? All kinds of strategies, different philosophical and educational approaches, those kind of things. Then in the core is the why. And Sinek's argument is that most organizations and institutions don't really look at the why. So many of us hear the phrase, start with why, or know your why, because of coming out of that work from Sinek. So as I was thinking about that, I thought, in my initial conversations with parents, the what kind of questions are there? And then really, I think what McConnell and Hearst were getting at was a lot of the how. How do we do that? But then really what's behind what McConnell and Hearst and I were finding, that's the why. And so for me, that three-circle model helped make some sense to sort out what was going on here. So in the article and in my dissertation, we kind of start with the what. So I had asked parents, what was the purpose of education? What do you want? And so that was a list of what's. So they want their students to be able to learn to think. It's not the school's job to teach religion, but it's also the school's job to teach work ethic and helping maximize their potential and do social and book learning. They really saw it as whole child development. Then when we looked at the how, the question becomes, all right, where does this overlap with McConnell and Hearst, and how do we build those things for students? So they really appreciated the fact that as we did this work, we really tried to relate it to the real world and really tried to make it so that students were understanding how educational concepts fit in some practical settings. They also appreciated that the schools themselves were not cliquish and students were learning to interact with lots of other people. They spoke a great deal about how their churches and their affiliated schools were very cliquish and people were in each other's business and there was drama that they didn't want because that got in the way of their students being able to really develop, which was a very interesting thing for me to hear and for them to be so open about in the conversations. They appreciated, meeting people outside their church. They really appreciated schools being a heterogeneous setting where where their students would be challenged in a variety of ways. And they did lament that in some ways, even before we had made this change to Millersburg School, the township in which it's located was becoming even more concentrated with Amish families. And so Millersburg itself was de facto becoming more Amish and an Amish school, then intentionally making these changes maybe accelerated that or just cemented that a little bit more. So there weren't as many English students attending Millersburg as there were at one time. So there was a little bit of apprehension about that as well. They did really appreciate learning real life skills, particularly science and hands-on science that we would do through inquiry-based kits, and that they weren't just, they weren't going to be farmers most likely because of the changing demographics and the lack of agricultural land in the township. So that was a problem as well. Many of them were comfortable to some degree with technology and the internet, not so much with it coming home, but many of these families understood that the devices probably wouldn't work when they came home anyway, because there wouldn't be access to the internet. So they had a level of understanding that I think many families did not, and they acknowledged that themselves. They appreciated quality adult teachers and teachers who knew their craft, and that there was busing and hot meals and field trips and all of those things. And even cost came up as a factor. Many appreciated the fact that it was a free public education versus what they would have to pay to send their students to the Amish school. So all of that painted the how. So they wanted their kids to build as good people. They wanted that development. This was how it was being done. But underneath the how, we began to see that there was the why. Why was this working for them? And Dr. Myers, who was on my committee, wrote a book with Stephen Nolt, and they were extensive scholars in the Amish. And they talked about how this group of Amish that run from kind of southern Elkhart County, diagonally across the county up into LaGrange County, are a kind of creative, conservative, creatively communal group of Amish. And they are willing to look at this and engage in a conversation with society to navigate where they're going to fit. And it's really about compromise. So they see, these families all reflected seeing a real sense of community. They appreciated the changes that had been made at Millersburg, that they didn't feel in some respects they deserved. One of the gentlemen that I spoke with and had been on my advisory committee and some other things, he just was like, how do you get the superintendent of the school district to come sit at your table and have a conversation? He goes, that just doesn't happen. And so our efforts of outreach were reciprocated by their recognition of the sincerity and the integrity of our staff, the practical aspects of what they were doing, and they knew that there were things they had to give on in order to strike that balance. And so that would be a very strong piece to say that the why here is that we as an institution reflected what our society should be. We were being democratic. We were being responsive. We were being culturally competent. And so all of those things came together to make this work. And so for me, the how that we did it became a symbol or representative of the why. And that for me was the most important thing. So I will go back to and say again that one of the most bothersome aspects of this study was that dual role that I had, because as we had these conversations, I couldn't help but note and wonder about the amount of deference that was taking place during the interviews. And I know that deference and respect and that humbleness is part of interaction with the Amish, but I could not fully decipher, and not to say they would dissemble or lie or anything, but I just was always wondering at the edge of that as to how much that was there. And was there more they would have or could have said that they didn't in an effort to just avoid conflict or making it problematic. Ultimately, I came down to decide that that wasn't the case. I think they were all very truthful. I think my relationship with enough of them from interactions, and again, one who had served on my parent advisory group, would have been such that they would have said, hey, Thalheimer, this is how it really is. So I really think that I settled peacefully and slept at night knowing that I think I did everything I could to make that happen. Just a couple prospects and conversations that came up out of the dissertation and some future things. I'm struck by the conversation with the one father who said that he really would like for there to be a way to think about schooling beyond 8th grade that wouldn't obligate children to have to go on to high school. And we had started some of these conversations, and I know schools in the area have, to various degrees, tried to figure out how can we potentially enroll Amish students part-time in our school. So technically they would leave our public schools and go to homeschool, but then they would enroll in our districts, not mine so much, but districts in the south and the east of here. How could they enroll in those districts to be able to continue doing particularly some career tech or vocational training that would be beyond just an 8th grade? So they could take some introductory engineering classes, they could take some construction classes, they could take some courses at the high school level through CTE for part of the day. Now that would require figuring out part-day transportation and some of those other tricky things, but that all might be worth it to be able to provide those students that additional training. And the one father in particular was very careful to use the word training rather than schooling, because I think he wanted to be careful of in the 8th grade, the Yoder decision, not create the slippery slope of saying we're going to go with, we need to extend schooling, but we need to extend training. And I could appreciate where he was coming from on that as well. There was also the idea, because people felt so connected to Millersburg as a school, that they wanted us to expand the back of Millersburg School and allow that to be a place where such training could happen, so that those students could just stay there and do that. So that was a very interesting thing that came up. During my interviews, there was conversation about homeschool. A lot of parents said that they could potentially consider homeschool, but were very reluctant to do so. They didn't want that burden themselves and couldn't see themselves doing that well. But they would consider potentially going back to the Amish school if there was a degradation in the respect, or there was a difficulty, or if the district were moving certain directions, or mandated that technology went home, and those kind of things. And then the other question that came up during the interviews and the process was, what could the public schools potentially do, again, to help train Amish school teachers? These would not be teachers who would be going through a full teacher preparatory program. That would not be part of that tradition. But the idea would be could they be taking some core subject, again, strategic core subjects, maybe some additional English, some additional math, maybe some additional social studies through high school, and then maybe junior and senior year have some cadet teaching experiences or an educational professions course. So again, not at all preparation to step into a public high school setting, although more and more with the shortage of teachers, people keep talking about knocking down the credentials, but at least have a little more maturity on the behalf of those teachers, and some more core content knowledge, and to have learned some strategies for some classroom management, and to be able to be more effective in the classroom than they are as potentially a 16-year-old girl trying to run a classroom of multiple age students. So those are some things that could be worth exploration as well. Regrettably, COVID had a major impact on Millersburg and all of these conversations. I went back and looked, and in my article, I referenced that in May of 2018, there were 448 students at Millersburg. By the time we got to the 2019-20 school year, so the school year where COVID kicked in at the end of the year, there were 507 students at Millersburg Elementary Middle School. So it had gone up 50, 60 students. So we were retaining, and they felt good in the program there. Then in 2020-21, it fell back to 457 students. And last year, 21-22, it was down to 389. So the masking that was required, and the closing down of schools that happened, and then the ramifications after that of masking and protocols, and when students would be out and have to work from home. Millersburg School and Fairfield schools in general sent home packets for students to work on. They weren't mandated to use technology, being aware of this situation, but all of that together unfortunately did an unraveling of this work, that the school is down now to the lowest enrollment it's been. I have not had a conversation with the superintendent down there to see where things are this year, but I knew last year and coming out of last year it was a concern, and it has revived the conversations of what do we do to get to this training aspect. It's really made that an urgent piece, so that school can remain viable. So that is something there. So I will just conclude here and then open it for questions to just say that, I mean, I'm a nerd, and so I appreciated the academic exercise as a scholar of doing this work. And my background is a history and English major, so I very much am into creating narratives and understanding stories and how all of that goes together. So the qualitative nature of this study was a natural fit for me and was where I wanted to go. And so it allowed me to create that narrative and capture that rich ethnographic picture that I thought was so important. But more than that for me personally, and more for being culturally competent in doing this and sharing that, I just felt it was very important to be true to the story of the people who live this. And so I hope, and from the feedback I've received and what people have told me, that the nature of the way I conducted my interviews and how I reported out my findings was honest and true to their voice. And that to me was the most important aspect of doing this work.